Our next speaker is Binoy Kampmark. Binoy, many of you here will know Binoy's work. He's an academic and writer whose work is informed by the intersection of law, international relations and history. His research covers conflict, diplomacy and global crises, including wars, terrorism and refugees. Binoy was a Commonwealth Scholar at Cambridge University. He was a WikiLeaks Senate candidate in 2013, a contributing editor to CounterPunch and a columnist for the Mandarin. He's written extensively about WikiLeaks publications and the vital role of the organisation and of Julian Assange in exposing abuses of power, the US efforts to extradite him and the dangers posed by the indictment. Binoy's talk is entitled Reviving and Restoring the Fourth Estate.
Well, everybody gathered today, thank you for your attendance. It's been wonderful to see you. And I want to thank Mary, of course, for the generous introduction, and also to my colleague Michael, whose media outlet is very important in terms of what he does and his contributors do there. In a sense, what I'm going to be talking about will link with a lot about what Michael has said, but what I'm going to do is to give a broader picture, as it were, about the role of what we call the Fourth Estate. And in a sense, this famous Fourth Estate idea, how it's been revived by WikiLeaks and its activities. The effort to disconnect the role played by WikiLeaks to the Fourth Estate is an essential part of the state policy that's being endorsed by the United States and by its allies. The idea is to make sure, or to attack Assange's role and WikiLeaks' role in actually opening the information environment to enable us to see who they are. They, that is, who wield the power unaccountably. First of all, let's look at the Fourth Estate itself. Some of you may know where it comes from. Some people say, firstly, that Edmund Burke, the great conservative politician, contemplated the idea when referring to the French Revolution. But it was Thomas Carlyle, the historian, very cranky man, but a very interesting fellow who had this strange idea about the hero in history. But he did have an interesting comment to make about the Fourth Estate. He called them the able editors. And in 1841, he wrote those famous lines. Burke said there were 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder, they sat a Fourth Estate more important than any of them all. And so often, the so-called Fourth Estate, the scribblers, the journalists, the scribes, the individuals, the whole individuals accountable, those in power accountable, are condemned as scurrilous, as seedy. In Anglophone countries, they're hounded in defamation actions. Michael's already alluded to some of those things. But then you have a strange situation where the Fourth Estate has, in a sense, been compromised. It's been compromised by corporatization. It's been compromised by agendas that are sown by the powers that be. It is limited in the effect of what it can do. In a sense, the coverage of Assange's fate is emblematic of this point. Many things that should be mentioned by the press are not. The details, Michael's already touched on it, the redaction. Not enough has been made about the fact that Julian Assange was very keen on redacting. And actually, at the witness testimonies that were put forth in the Old Bailey trial, the extradition trial, emphasized the point. Those who have worked with Assange actually did say that in some ways he was almost overly cautious in certain instances. And this point has not been, as it were, done justice to. So in a broader sense, what WikiLeaks has done is to oxygenate the body, as it were, of the Fourth Estate by reviving it, cut by the spin, enable you here, ladies and gentlemen, to actually see the documents being used. In itself, it's been a revolution. You can actually see what happens or what happened in a series of decisions that were made. You see history in real time. You see the evolution of a decision-making process, and you are not hidden from it. And most of all, you're not as it were, censored from it by individuals who tell you they know better. One of the most important things to understand here, and that is the dangerous reasoning that lies at the indictment, but also at the reasoning of Judge Vanessa Baraitser in her decision in January 4th, 2021, even though she did find the conditions of the extradition oppressive and did rule in favor of Julian's case, she accepted the prosecutor's arguments wholesale. She had a very dim view of the press and a very dim view about what WikiLeaks does. Far better to let the port-sipping, brandy-swilling Whitehall Mandarins tell you what to think or what happened, a decision that was made. Far better to let the individuals in the security establishment in Washington, D.C. tell you what to see. And that is the key problem, the key issue that we face today. In Australia, there is this very strange program called Insiders. I find it very odd. Shouldn't be insiders. The journalists should keep some kind of objective distance here, a fair distance to the subject matter. It's a bit chummy here in Australia. It's a bit nauseating, actually. And it is something that we see constantly a lot of. But then we have instances such as WikiLeaks and the efforts there to show the raw document in its form. And I can fully accept that there are many arguments about the way of information, how it develops, and I'm not naive to the idea that information needs context. I fully am aware of that. But if you look at the WikiLeaks work, for example, in informing individuals about the evolution of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has gone through several iterations now, but it's very important. If you go through the documentation about the chapter on the environment, for example, it is illuminating to see which countries did what and voted for what in terms of, say, protecting the environment. The so-called red lines, the so-called amendments, and so on. It is vital to get a sense about what happens here because it's good to know what they are up to, the officials, elected or otherwise, who represent us in various ways. To know what the decision makers are up to. Sadly, as such, hopefully this will change. WikiLeaks, for example, would be indispensable in revealing to us exactly what AUKUS is about. There's a lot of hysteria about, for example, when the Chinese make a security pact with the Solomon Islands, there's a lot of issue about secrecy there, but I'll tell you what, they love secrecy about AUKUS here. So we don't know, for example, whether United States assets deploy nuclear weapons. We don't know how long they've been doing so, and we don't know whether the submarines that are coming in and will be based in WA, in Western Australia, will have nuclear weapons upon them. It is a serious and grave violation of several compacts of international law that Australia is a part of. We need a WikiLeaks, as it were, to reveal what exactly the Australian government has been doing with this arrangement. It is a very grave thing that has happened, and ignorance is not bliss. The thing that is vital to understand here, and I would like to put it a bit differently about the way the prosecution has been arranged against Julian in this particular instance. And you have to understand that it's seen as a very radical departure in terms of understanding the First Amendment in the United States. It's seen as a radical departure in terms of targeting a journalist. But I would say, that lovely French expression, it's bien pensant. It is orthodox. It's the view of the state. The state hates the Fourth Estate. The state power hates it by definition because it keeps an eye on them. So fundamentally, and we need to remember even in the United States itself, and I do cherish the Free Press Amendment in the US, something that we don't have in Australia, but we should not forget that individuals such as Saint Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, old Abe, sent his Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, to go and shutter numerous newspapers that were deemed against the government during the Civil War. In 1864, he shuttered numerous papers in Maryland. It was particularly a case in the border states that were involved in the secession dispute in the US. Editors were arrested. Publishers were arrested. We shouldn't forget that, if you fast forward it to later, we shouldn't forget that a grand jury was in panel to target a New York Times journalist in the context of the Pentagon Papers leak. The only reason it failed, ladies and gentlemen, was because, as I think most of you may know, it failed because the case collapsed by virtue of the plumbers, the so-called infamous Nixon plumbers, who ended up breaking into the psychiatric offices, of course, of the key figure of the Pentagon Papers leak, Daniel Ellsberg. So efforts have been made to do this before, and the vicious instrument that is known as the Espionage Act is the key here. And that is why it's being used in its Kafkaesque nastiness. And it is a Kafkaesque nasty document if you go through it, because what it does is delegitimize motivation. It actually takes out of the equation the motivation for publishing something. And it's no accident that if you go through the indictment, you will see written very clearly that the prosecution has decided not to mention the items that WikiLeaks did reveal. Collateral murder, for example, the video, the extent of torture used in Guantanamo, the torture sites used by the CIA, any number of these things. What the indictment instead focuses on is a very narrow belt of so-called culpability for revealing identities. So it's been very consciously done, and I think to a certain extent I would argue that the Fourth Estate, in a sense, has not been as good about keeping up about these manipulations as it should have. If you look at the arguments that were made in February, made last month at the appeal that was being made, which will be critical for Julian's fate, we saw the same arguments made recycled by Claire Dobbin KC, representing the US government. For example, no immunity for journalists to break the law is conferred by US law or the First Amendment. Well, yes, thank you for the undergraduate lesson. The fact of the matter is, anyone who knows this case knows that journalists have to also abide by certain areas of the law, but it is perfectly appropriate to publish certain national security information material within the remit of a free press and free opinion. And this is the sort of thing that they keep deflecting in arguments. The argument about harm taking place, it's very sinister. If you look at Dobbin's arguments, she claims, for example, at some point that an Ethiopian journalist went missing. Not many details about that. Others went missing. But when she was pressed about giving details, she had none, and she could not causally link those particular instances about what happened in the indictment and, of course, what happened in the broader sense about what is alleged. So that brings us back, and Michael spoke a bit about this, about the way the activities have been reported. Members of the Fourth Estate have been very naughty here. They've taken the loot, they've run with it, and they've criticized WikiLeaks for actually doing so. So what they've done is, and you have to remember the language used from 2010 onwards initially by papers such as The Guardian, by journalists such as David Lee, the emphasis on theft was kept being used. And then you see the same language being used in the indictment. So they have a lot to answer for. Individuals, and I have to say, for as much as some of you might respect him, the follies of Peter Greste, who himself had worked for Al Jazeera. And so, but what Peter did was, he wrote a cod ordinary piece expressing the view that Assange was not a journalist. So we should not forget that. We have individuals in the stable, as it were, who are very unhappy with Assange. Some of it, as Michael has said, is sheer envy. Yeah, this is a very vital thing to understand here. But even more to the point, and the coverage of the trial and the coverage of his detention, but also the coverage of him being taken out of the embassy was emblematic of this one fundamental fact, that members of the press stable and the state tend to work hand in hand often. How often do they not go beyond the press release? How often do they simply accept what is stated? It's the insiders again. They accept what is given by a government press release. They don't actually go into it. Thank goodness for the likes of WikiLeaks, and thank goodness for the likes of Michael West Media and so on, who actually go behind the scenes. So amongst this bleakness, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at some of what I would say is a bit of ray of light in this dance of darkness. That is, the tide has shifted. Finally, the Fourth Estate and Julian have somehow come together in the popular imagination that was inconceivable some years ago. We had, for example, the historic motion proposed and passed in the Australian Parliament on February 14th, accepting what Assange has been doing and what WikiLeaks has been doing in terms of their publications, that this was an issue of free speech, that this was an issue of revealing war crimes, that this was an issue of revealing, as it were, the nature of US war machine strategy. We've also had 75 German parliamentarians sign a letter stating more or less the same thing. We also have the remarks made by certain US members of Congress. We have House Resolution 934, demanding that the US drop all charges and attempts to extradite Julian Assange. Also, that this constitutes a direct threat to the First Amendment. And we also have a February letter to the US Department of Justice from 35 law professors based in the US expressing a united front in, and I quote their words, concern about the constitutional implications of prosecuting Assange, and warning, and I quote, that this could extend beyond the Espionage Act and beyond national security journalism to enable the prosecution of routine news gathering under any number of ambiguous laws and untested legal theories. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen gathered today on this important occasion, this is one of the most dangerous prosecutions against the press that has ever been mounted. You will hear during the day, and you've probably heard, and you've heard to a certain extent some material, the extraterritorial implications. You will certainly hear that in the next session, about how dangerous this act is. Remember that in the United States, when it was passed, you had individuals like Senator La Follette warning us about the dangers of having such a vicious wartime statute on the books. And let us not forget that politicians were actually imprisoned under the Espionage Act. One of them was Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate. He actually ran from prison. I'm sure Trump might take a few tips, I'm not sure. But he ran from prison and got 3% of the vote, having been convicted under the Espionage Act. Out of the 17 of the 18 charges that are drawn from it, the attempt has been to revile a legitimate activity, but not just legitimate activity, but a novel activity insofar as it has brought information to you and I, so that we can decide, not the Whitehall Mandarins, not the individuals in the Canberra Gallery, and certainly, ladies and gentlemen, not the insiders.
Thank you, Binoy. And listening to you, it occurred to me that the mainstream media will be in crisis mode at present because we are far better informed than we would have been if that was left in their hands because of the internet. We're seeing pictures, video material, and we have sources of information that weren't available to us in the past. One of the problems, however, is that the citizenry is very much divided into groups that do access this technology and therefore what it offers, and those that are still really relying on the mainstream media.